He didn't even look up when she walked in. Damian Kade, a man who made grown men sweat through their shirts just by entering a room, sat at the head of his own anniversary dinner table and kept his eyes on the woman beside him. Lena Park, 29 years old, his assistant, and something far worse than that. But what happened next, what he said out loud, in front of his mother, his brother, his captains. That was the moment Serena Whitmore stopped being a wife and became something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to protect him from. She had carried his empire for 12 years in silence. Tonight, she would finally put it down. And the black leather case she walked out with? It contained everything he never bothered to read until it was already too late. If you've ever given everything to someone who gave your place away to someone else, stay with me, because this story is for you. So subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began to fall apart. The invitation had said 7 o'clock. Damian arrived at 7:43, and he brought company. Serena had been sitting at the long oak table in the private dining room of the Kade estate for nearly an hour, by then long enough to have 2 glasses of water, exchange pleasantries with Eleanor Kade, Damian's mother, and listen to his younger brother Marcus tell the same story about a golf trip to Scottsdale that she had heard twice before. She'd smiled at the right moments, laughed lightly when it seemed expected. She had spent 12 years becoming very good at performing the version of herself that made everyone around her comfortable. She was still performing when the door opened, and Damian walked in with Lena Park at his shoulder. There was nothing technically wrong with that. Lena was his executive assistant. She had attended company dinners before. Serena had even approved of the hire 3 years ago. Sharp girl, organized, quick. She had told Damian so at the time, but Serena had also spent the last 7 months learning what sharp girls with organized minds can do when they are left alone with a man who mistakes admiration for love. She noticed things in the order that they hit her. First, Lena's dress. Black, close-fitted. Not the kind of dress you wore to your boss's anniversary dinner unless you had stopped thinking of him as your boss. Second, Damian's hand, hovering just a half-second too close to the small of Lena's back before he seemed to remember where he was and lowered it. Third, the way Lena glanced at Serena, not with guilt, not with apology, but with the careful, measured look of someone who has already decided how they feel about a situation and is simply waiting to see if the other party has figured it out yet. Serena picked up her water glass and drank. "Sorry we're late," Damian said to the table. He pulled out a chair and sat down, and the dozen people around the table shifted and settled the way they always did when Damian Kade entered a space, adjusting their posture, brightening their expressions, angling themselves slightly toward him, like plants rotating toward a window. He looked at Serena and gave her a nod. Not a smile. A nod. Happy anniversary, she thought. 12 years. No trouble at all, Eleanor said, signaling the kitchen staff. She did not look at Lena Park. Eleanor Kade had the gift of acknowledging only things she had chosen to acknowledge. Dinner proceeded the way those dinners always proceeded. Courses arrived. Wine was poured. Marcus held court. Vincent Tao, Damian's head of operations, told a story about a shipping dispute in Memphis that somehow became a story about his college roommate. The wives talked among themselves. The captain spoke carefully, watching Damian for cues on what was worth laughing at. Serena ate her dinner. She had not planned tonight to be the night. She had not woken up this morning and decided that 12 years of marriage would end between the appetizer and dessert. But somewhere between the second course and the moment Damian refilled Lena's wine glass, before Serena's a small thing, a nothing thing, except that it wasn't nothing. It was the 10,000th small stacked on top of 9,999 others. She felt something in her chest go very quiet. Not broken, not even angry, just quiet, like a room after a noise stops. She had been waiting, she realized, for months, maybe longer. Waiting for Damian to come home one evening and say, "I know what I've been doing, and I'm going to stop." Waiting for a conversation that kept not happening. Waiting for the man she had married, sharp, self-aware, capable of tremendous tenderness when he chose to exercise it, to choose to exercise it in her direction. He had not chosen. So tonight she had brought the black leather case. She had put it in the coat check herself. told the attendant she would retrieve it before midnight. Just a precaution, she'd told herself. Just in case. It turned out she had known herself better than she realized. Damian stood up midway through the main course. He rarely made speeches at family dinners. That was Marcus's territory. Marcus, who loved the sound of his own voice and had the audience skills to back it up. But tonight, Damian stood, and he buttoned his jacket, the way he always did before addressing a room, and he picked up his wine glass, and every person at the table went still. "I want to take a moment," he said, "to talk about something I've been planning for a while." Serena set her fork down. Something in his voice, not warmth, exactly, but the specific register he used when he had already made a decision and was informing the room rather than consulting it, made her fold her hands in her lap. The expansion division has been one of Kade Meridian's most significant growth engines over the past 2 years, Damian said. He smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. He was proud. "We've entered 4 new markets. We've increased consolidated revenue by 31%. And a lot of that growth happened because someone with a sharp eye and a sharper mind pushed it forward." Serena breathed very slowly. "Lena," Damian said, turning toward his assistant, "I'd like to announce in front of everyone who matters to me that I'm formally elevating you to Director of Expansion, effective the 1st of the month." The room applauded. It was light applause, the kind that happens automatically when someone is waiting for more information before they commit. Eleanor Cade's hands touched once and separated. Marcus lifted his glass halfway before putting it back down. Vincent Dow clapped 3 times, which was his version of enthusiasm. Lena Parks smiled, a practiced, gracious, not quite humble smile, and said, "Thank you, Damian. I won't let you down. I know you won't." Damian sat back down, and Serena thought, there it is. Because she had built that division. She had built it from a 12-page concept document she had drafted on a Sunday afternoon, because she could see where Kade Meridian's revenue model was stagnating, and she knew how to fix it. But she had spent 18 months negotiating entry frameworks for those 4 markets. She had identified the regulatory exposure, restructured the contractor payment sequences, and personally flagged the 2 distribution partners who had tried to skim margins in the second quarter. She had done all of it, and she had done all of it without a title, without compensation beyond her existing arrangement, and without once asking Damian to acknowledge it publicly, because she had believed, with the specific brand of faith, that long marriages manufacture, that the acknowledgement was coming. He had given it to someone else, not the acknowledgement, the position, the title, the credit. He had handed the thing she built to the woman he was sleeping with, in front of his mother and his board and their friends, on their 12th wedding anniversary. Serena sat very still. She was aware of Eleanor Cade's eyes on her face. She was aware of Marcus watching from across the table with an expression she couldn't quite read. She was aware of Lena Park holding a wine glass with both hands and carefully not looking in her direction. She thought about all the mornings she had gotten up at 5:30 to review accounts before Damian's phone calls started. She thought about the weekend in February when she'd spent 11 hours rebuilding a financial model that had been structurally compromised by a data entry error, and Damian had come into the study at 9 that evening and said, "You're still at that?" She thought about the 14 emails she had sent him over the last 14 months, one every 30 days, each one containing more specific evidence than the last, each one opened and not responded to, each one apparently filed under whatever category his brain reserved for his wife's concerns. She thought about all of it, and then she stopped thinking about it, because there was nothing left to think. She reached down and removed her wedding ring. It was a beautiful ring. 3 carats, platinum setting, the stone she had chosen herself, because Damian had told her to pick whatever she wanted, and she had wanted something that wasn't flashy, understated. She had worn it for 12 years without taking it off, except for 3 surgeries. She placed it on the table beside his wine glass. She was aware that the table had gone very quiet. Serena Eleanor began. "I'm done fighting for a man," Serena said, "who keeps giving my place away." Her voice was calm. It surprised her how calm it was. She had imagined this moment, or something like it during the long drive over tonight, and she had imagined herself crying, or shaking, or struggling to get the words out. But her voice came out, the way it always did, when she was working through a complex problem. Level, clear, precise. She stood up. She set her napkin beside her plate. "The ring is yours," she said to Damian. "It can go to whoever needs it next." She walked out. The coat check attendant handed her the black leather case without a word. She signed the ticket, collected her coat, and walked through the front door of the Kade estate and the stone steps to the car she had parked herself because she had not wanted a driver tonight. She had not wanted anyone watching her face on the way home. She drove 3 blocks before she had to pull over. She sat in a car for 6 minutes. She did not cry. She pressed her fingers flat against the steering wheel and breathed until the tight thing in her chest loosened enough to let her think. Then she drove to her sister's house because she had made that phone call 2 weeks ago. Her sister Dana had not asked questions. Dana had made up the guest room, stocked the refrigerator with things Serena actually ate, and met her at the door with the look of a woman who has been waiting for a call that is a long time coming. "You okay?" Dana asked. "Not even a little," Serena said. "Good." Dana took the leather case from her. "That means you're done lying to yourself." Damian did not understand what was in the case until the next morning. That first hour after Serena left, he had been angry. He'd covered it well. Damian Kade was a man who had spent 30 years learning to cover things well, but Marcus could see it, and Eleanor could see it, and Vincent Tao was smart enough to look at the centerpiece for an extended period of time. Lena had excused herself quietly, which he appreciated. His mother had walked him to the door before the dessert course and said, in the way Eleanor Kade communicated things, she considered too large for normal words. "Whatever you think you're managing, Damian, you've already lost your grip on it." Then she had gone back to the table and spent 45 minutes being a gracious hostess, because Eleanor Kade understood that the performance of stability was itself a form of power. He went home that night to an empty house. The master bedroom had that particular quality of a space where someone has removed their belongings with intention, not messiness, not chaos, but the specific absence of things that had always been there. The reading glasses on Serena's nightstand. The small leather notebook she kept by the lamp. The photograph from their second year of marriage, Serena laughing at something off camera on a beach in Portugal that had stood on the dresser, so long he had stopped seeing it, as a photograph and just experienced it as part of the room's geography. It was gone. He stood in the middle of the bedroom for a while. Then he went to his study and opened the email account he used for personal correspondence. He found her first message sent 14 months ago, time-stamped 6:47 in the morning on a Tuesday. "Damian, I've flagged something in the Q3 subsidiary reports. The authorization codes for the Lakeview transfers don't align with your travel schedule that week. You were in Seoul. Someone ran these using your credentials. I need you to tell me if I'm misreading this, because if I'm not, we have a serious problem." He had read that email. He remembered reading it. He had thought, and he could recall the exact texture of the thought now, which he found deeply uncomfortable that Serena worried too much, that she was a forensic accountant and therefore professionally disposed toward seeing problems, that the Lakeview transfers had been Victor's territory, and Victor was the most trustworthy man in his organization. He had replied to that email with, "Talk to Victor. He handles the subsidiary authorizations now." He scrolled to the next message, then the next 14 emails, 14 months. Each one more specific than the last. Authorization codes, shell entities, a company called Northgate Asset Services that he had never heard of, a warehouse purchase in Cicero that was not in any Kade Meridian filing, a pattern of transfers that, when laid out the way Serena had laid them out, in clear, sequential forensic language, told a story so obvious that he felt physically ill, trying to understand why he had not seen it sooner. Victor Hahn, the man who had mentored him, the man who had stood at his father's side for 2 decades, and then stood at Damian's side when his father couldn't anymore. The man who called him son, not as a figure of speech, but as a statement of intention. Damian sat at his desk until 4 in the morning reading his wife's warnings. Then he called his head of securities, find out what Serena took with her when she left the estate tonight, he said. The answer came back inside an hour. 1 black leather case. Contents unknown. Retrieved from coach at the estate. Serena had been the last to drop anything there and the first to retrieve it. Damian hung up and sat in the dark. He had learned, in 30 years of running things that operated outside ordinary systems, that the most dangerous person in any organization was not the one with the most power or the most violence at their disposal. It was the one who knew where the real records were kept. His wife had been keeping records for 12 years, and he had just publicly embarrassed her in front of a person whose opinion mattered to him, given her position to his mistress, and handed her a reason to stop caring what happened to him. He picked up the wedding ring from the side table where he'd put it after the dinner. He held it in his palm. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. She's already been in contact with independent forensic investigators. You should know that before you make any decisions about how to handle this, there are people in this city who are hoping you handle it badly. Friend. Damian read the text 3 times. Then he set the ring down and reached for his phone. Not to call Victor. Not yet. First, he needed to know exactly how badly he had failed to listen. Serena woke up at 5:30 out of habit, in Dana's guest room, with the leather case on the floor beside the bed, where she had put it before she fell asleep. She lay there for a moment and listened to the sound of the house, the refrigerator hum, a car passing outside, the specific quality of early morning silence in a home that was not hers. She had slept poorly, which she had expected. Her chest felt hollowed out, which she had also expected. What she had not expected was how much lighter her hands felt without the ring. She got up, made coffee in Dana's kitchen without turning on the overhead light, and sat at the kitchen table with the leather case on the chair beside her. She had started the Atlas Ledger 4 years into her marriage, when she first began to understand what Damian's world actually looked like beneath its legitimate surface. She had not created it out of suspicion of Damian specifically. She had created it because she was a forensic accountant, and she was living inside a financial structure of significant complexity, and she was constitutionally incapable of inhabiting a financial structure without understanding it completely. What she'd found, over years of careful, methodical documentation, was not one large crime, but hundreds of small decisions, each individually defensible and collectively damning. The ledger recorded all of it, not to use it against anyone, just to know. 4 years ago, she had begun to notice Victor Hahn's signature in places where it should not have been. A coffee cup ring bled through the edge of her notepad from last night. She pressed her fingertip to it and traced it absently. She had wanted to be wrong about Victor. She had genuinely, specifically wanted to be wrong about him, because she understood what it would mean for Damian if she wasn't. Victor was not just his consigliere. Victor was the closest thing Damian had to a father still living. To discover that man had been stealing from him, building against him, would be the kind of wound that didn't announce itself. It would go underground and damage the foundation section. She had tried to warn Damian. For 14 months she had tried. She opened the leather case and removed the top file. She had already been in contact with David Reyes, the forensic investigator she'd worked with on 3 corporate cases over the past decade, the one man outside Damian's world she trusted completely. David had agreed to handle the ledger through his firm's independent investigations process. The banking metadata she'd compiled would go through his analysts. The authentication work, proving that the transfers Serena had flagged could not have been authorized by Damian because he was physically elsewhere, would be ironclad before anyone filed anything. She was not doing this to hurt Damian. She was doing this because Victor Hahn had been quietly burning the house down for years, and someone had to hand the fire department a map. Her phone lit up on the table, a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Then something made her answer. Mrs. Kade, said a voice. She recognized immediately, even though she hadn't heard it in years, low, deliberate, carrying the careful warmth of a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of seeming trustworthy. Victor Hahn. It's Whitmore, she said. I went back to Whitmore. A brief pause. Of course, I heard about last night. I'm sorry. Are you Serena? His voice shifted slightly, losing the warmth but not the control. I want to talk to you about the materials you removed from the estate. I think there may be some misunderstanding about what those files represent, and there's no misunderstanding, Victor. Silence. I've spent 4 years understanding exactly what those files represent, she said, down to the authorization code sequences and the timing windows. I know what you did. I know how long you've been doing it. And I know why you spent so much energy making sure Damian stopped listening to me. Another pause. Longer this time. You're going through a difficult time, Victor said carefully. Emotions run high. Things can seem... I'll stop you there, Serena said. She picked up her coffee cup and took a sip. Her hand was completely steady. "Don't call this number again." She ended the call. She sat for a moment in Data's quiet kitchen with the early light beginning to come through the window. Then she opened her pad, wrote down the time and the number Victor had called from, and added it to the documentation file. Everything Victor did from this point forward was Data. Serena understood something about powerful men that they rarely understood about themselves. They believed their power protected them from consequences. They believed it so deeply and for so long that the Shmifum stopped making these careful moves that had built their power in the first place. They got sloppy. They got impatient. They made phone calls they should not have made at 5:58 in the morning to women they had underestimated for too long. She closed the notepad. She had a meeting with David Reyes at 9. She had work to do. Damian did not call Victor that morning. He wanted to. The pull of it was almost physical. 12 years of trusting that voice, that particular combination of experience and authority and apparent loyalty, made it almost automatic to reach for the phone and say, "I need to understand something," to give Victor the chance to explain, to let the explanation be convincing, because Damian had a well-documented history of finding Victor's explanations convincing. He did not make the call. Instead, he called a woman named Janet Sue, a forensic auditor he had used twice before on external acquisition reviews, someone with no ties to Victor Hahn or anyone in Victor's network. He asked her to come in on a private basis, not through Kade Meridian's official audit channels, not through any department Victor had any influence over, just her and 2 analysts of her choosing, working from raw subsidiary data he would pull himself. Janet Sue asked no questions about the circumstances. She named a rate and said she could start Monday. "I need you to start today," Damian said. Another pause. "Double rate. Done." He spent the rest of the morning pulling files. He was not a numbers man. He had never been a numbers man, which was something he had always considered simply a fact about himself, rather than a gap, the way some people just aren't visual or just aren't musical. He ran his operation on relationships, on instinct, on the ability to read a room and a person with an accuracy that had saved his life twice and his empire many more times than that. But he could read Serena's emails now with the specific horror of a man who has been handed a map of a building he's been living in and realizes for the first time that the floor plan is completely different from what he thought. Northgate Asset Services. 16 transfers over 22 months. Total, $4,300,000. Cicero warehouse property, purchased through a shell entity whose registered agent was a paralegal with a law firm that shared its building with Victor Hahn's private office. Authorization windows. 11 of the 16 Northgate transfers occurred during periods when Damian was documented as traveling outside Illinois. The credentials used were his. The geography didn't match. He sat at his desk and read until his eyes hurt. By early afternoon, Marcus appeared in the doorway. Marcus was 3 years younger than Damian and had spent most of his adult life deliberately not learning the details of how Kade Meridian worked. He ran two restaurants and a real estate fund and had made it his personal policy to understand only what he absolutely needed to understand about his brother's world. But he had also known Damian since Damian was 7 years old, and he could read his brother's face like a language he'd grown up speaking. He sat down in the chair across from the desk without being invited. "How bad?" he said. Damian looked at him for a long moment. "Bad," he said. Marcus nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "You know, she tried to tell you." "I know. I mean, for a long time. Not just recently." Marcus turned a pen over in his fingers, a nervous habit from childhood that he had never broken. "She mentioned something to me last spring. I didn't push. I figured it was, I don't know what I figured. You figured I had it handled. We all figured you had it handled. That's the problem with being you, Damian. People assume the figure at the front of the room sees everything." He set the pen down. "What are you going to do about the ledger?" "Nothing." Marcus looked at him. "I mean, I'm not going to go after her for it," Damian said. "She built that ledger. Whatever's in it, she built it. And if it says what her emails say it says." He stopped. He picked up his brother's pen and turned it in his own fingers, the way Marcus did. "She's the only reason this comes apart in a way that doesn't take us down with it," he said. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "You should have listened to her," he finally said. "Not cruelly, just as a fact. I know that. She's not going to come back because you finally figured it out. I know that too. Damian put the pen down. Outside the window, Chicago went about its business trucks and taxis and construction noise, the ordinary machinery of a city that did not know or care about what was happening in this room. He had built his version of this city over decades. He had built it on relationships and loyalty and a particular understanding of power that had served him well. He had not built it on listening to his wife. He thought about the empty space on the dresser where the Portugal photograph had been. Then he turned back to the files, because there was nothing else to do, and Serena had given him somewhere to start. He was starting. It was, he understood, the least he could do. David Reyes had an office that looked like a man had moved in 20 years ago and never quite finished unpacking. 2 whiteboards covered in overlapping diagrams, a filing cabinet with a dented corner that had clearly lost an argument with something heavy, and a desk so buried under folders and printouts that the actual surface was theoretical. Serena had always found it oddly comforting. It looked like a place where real work happened, not the performance of work. She sat across from him now, with the Atlas ledger open between them, and David was doing what David always did when he encountered a financial structure. He found genuinely interesting leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, reading without speaking, occasionally making a small sound in the back of his throat that was not quite a word. He had been reading for 40 minutes. Serena drank her coffee and waited. The Cicero property, David finally said without looking up. March, 3 years ago. The registered agent, a paralegal named Thomas Briggs, employed by Leland Chow and Associates, whose office suite shares the 14th floor of the Merchandise Mart building, with an entity called HV Capital Advisors, which is my Victor Hahn's private holding company. David sat back. He rubbed his face with both hands, the way he did when something was bigger than he'd expected. Serena, I know. This isn't skimming. This isn't someone helping themselves to extra margin on side deals. He gestured at the ledger. This man built a parallel structure. He's been doing it for years. Do you understand what that means? It means he wasn't planning to steal from Damian, Serena said. He was planning to replace him. David was quiet. The warehouses in Cicero and the 2 in Bridgeport, she continued, are positioned within half a mile of Cade Meridian's 3 largest distribution nodes. If the legitimate business ever became legally or financially untenable, if Damian's operation collapsed under investigation or lost its banking relationships, Victor would have an operational logistics network already in place, already relationships with the same vendors, already familiar with the same routes. He could absorb the business inside 90 days, and nobody would know it was the same business. Everybody would know. Nobody would be able to prove it. David picked up one of the files and turned a page. He had the reading posture of a man who had spent 30 years finding things that other people had hidden, and his face when he found something significant was completely still, no triumph, no excitement, just a very focused kind of quiet. The banking metadata, he said. My analyst pulled the timestamp logs from the Northgate transfers. 11 of the 16 occurred between 8 p.m. and 2 a.m. in Windows, when Damian was documented as traveling internationally. His travel records, hotel check-ins, flight manifests, credit card activity in Seoul, in Frankfurt, in Toronto put him on another continent when those authorization codes were run. Someone had his credentials. Victor had access to everything. He's had access to everything for 15 years. Serena closed the ledger. The question isn't whether the evidence is there. It is there. The question is whether we can authenticate it before Victor finds a way to complicate the narrative. He's already trying, David said. Serena looked at him. I got a call this morning from a lawyer I've dealt with before, Franklin Moore, commercial litigation, mid-sized firm on Michigan Avenue. He was fishing. Very casual, very collegial. Asked me what I was working on. Asked specifically whether I'd had any recent contact with principals related to Cade Meridian. David set the file down. Franklin Moore represents 3 of Victor Hahn's private entities. The room was very quiet. So he knows I came to you, Serena said. He knows or he suspects. Either way, someone's paying attention. David met her eyes. He's going to move fast. If he thinks you're about to drop this on independent investigators, he'll try to get ahead of it. Claim the materials were improperly obtained. Claim you violated some confidentiality provision in your marital agreement. He'll try to tie up the ledger in a legal dispute long enough to move the assets. I anticipated that. Serena reached into the leather case and produced a second folder thinner, bound with a clip. The ledger was independently created and maintained by me on my own equipment over 12 years. It references Cade Meridian records, but contains no proprietary data that I did not have authorized access to as an officer of the company's expansion division. I have documentation of my access permissions, signed by Damian Kade, dated across 4 separate years. David took the folder. He read the top page. He turned to the second. He made the small sound in the back of his throat again. You've been preparing this for how long? 14 months, Serena said, since I understood Victor wasn't going to stop. David set the folder down carefully. All right, he said. He picked up his pen. Let's talk about how we do this in the right order. Victor Hahn arrived at Cade Meridian's headquarters at 9:15, which was his normal time, which was itself a choice. A guilty man would have come in early or not at all. Victor came in at his normal time, spoke to his assistant about his schedule for the weeks, accepted a coffee, and was sitting at the conference table in the executive suite when Damian walked in at 9:40. Damian was not late. He had waited in the parking structure for 20 minutes specifically to arrive after Victor, because he wanted to see Victor already settled in a room before he had to look at his face. He needed to know whether he could still look at that face and keep his voice level. He could. That surprised him slightly. Rough night, Victor said. He said it with the warmth of a man who had been watching Damian navigate rough nights for 30 years and felt genuine sympathy about all of them. I heard what happened at dinner. I'm sorry. Are you? Damian said. He pulled out a chair and sat down across the table rather than at the head, which was also a choice. He set a single folder on the table, but didn't open it. Victor's eyes moved to the folder and back to Damian's face. A very brief movement, less than a second. But Damian had been watching Victor's face for 3 decades, and he knew every note of its instrument. The Lakeview authorizations, Damian said. February 3 years ago. Walk me through them. Victor's expression did not change. That was the thing about Victor's face. Had never been a window to anything. It had always been a door, and he was the one who decided whether it opened. That was a subsidiary restructuring during the northern expansion. Standard reallocation. Why? The transfers ran on my credentials. Yes. You authorized the restructuring. I was in Seoul. Silence. I was in Seoul from the 7th through the 14th, Damian said. The Lakeview transfers ran on the 9th and the 11th. I have the hotel records. I have the flight manifest. I have a dinner receipt from a restaurant in Gangnam on the evening of the 9th. He paused. Someone ran my credentials while I was on another continent. Victor's face was still, completely, professionally still. There was a standing authorization structure in place for the subsidiary accounts, he said. You signed a delegation of authority document in January of that year. Your credentials could be used for specific transaction categories within defined limits. We discussed this. Show me the document. I'll have my assistant. Now, Victor. The temperature in the room had not changed. The furniture had not moved. Damian had not raised his voice or shifted his posture. But something in the quality of the silence between the two of them had altered in a way that both men felt completely. Victor looked at Damian for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and sent a text. His assistant appeared in the doorway 3 minutes later with a document. Victor slid it across the table. Damian read it. It was technically a delegation of authority form. His signature was on it. He could see that it was his signature, the particular slant of the D, the way he'd been writing his name for 20 years. The form authorized the use of his executive credentials for subsidiary account transactions within a defined set of parameters. The transaction limits were vaguely written, broad enough to cover almost anything. Damian set the document down on the table. He looked at Victor, and Victor looked back at him with the calm, weathered, paternal expression that Damian had trusted for 30 years. The expression that said, I have been in this organization longer than anyone, and I have held it together through things you don't even fully know about, and your discomfort right now is something I understand. And have compassion, for even if it is somewhat misplaced. Serena raised concerns about the Lakeview transfers. 14 months ago, Damian said. Serena raised concerns about many things. Victor stopped himself, chose different words. Serena is a very meticulous woman. In my experience, forensic accountants sometimes develop a tendency to find irregularities because finding irregularities is what they are trained to do. It doesn't always mean she was right, wasn't she? It was not a question. Damian said it the way he said things when they were no longer questions. Victor's jaw tightened. One small movement, gone in less than a second. I would be very careful, Victor said quietly. About what you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything. Damian opened the folder. He turned it so that Victor could see the top sheet, a summary of the Northgate transfers, the shell entity structure, the Cicero property filing. I'm telling you what I found. Victor looked at the page. His face was still. Damian watched it the way you watch a building in the moment before you understand that something structural has gone wrong, looking for the crack. Where did you get this? Victor said. Does it matter? It matters if Serena Whitmore provided it, because materials she removed from corporate property during an emotionally volatile. She didn't provide it. Damian closed the folder. I pulled the subsidiary data myself and gave it to a forensic auditor with no connection to you or anyone in this organization. What you're looking at is what she found in 3 days. He paused. Serena's been sitting on this for 14 months. Victor stood up. It was a slow movement, careful, the movement of a man in his late 60s who had a bad knee and had learned to rise from chairs deliberately. But there was something underneath the deliberateness, a recalibration, Damian thought. Victor was deciding something. You're making an accusation that will damage this organization, Victor said. Not just me, this organization. The relationships we have. The people who depend on this structure functioning. You are prepared to tear that down based on a set of financial documents compiled by a woman who has every reason to be hostile to this family right now? I'm prepared to follow the numbers, Damian said, which is something I should have done 14 months ago. Damian. I'd like you to take the rest of the week off, Damian said, with pay, while the audit is completed. Victor's eyes were very steady, very dark. You're suspending me. I'm asking you to take some time off. Do not do this, Victor said. His voice had dropped to something quieter, and therefore more dangerous. I have been in this organization since before you ran it. I held it together during the transition after your father. I held it together when you were 28 years old, and you didn't know the difference between a legitimate licensing dispute and a declaration of war. I built half of what you think you built. I know, Damian said. Then act like you know I am. Damian stood up. He buttoned his jacket. That's why I'm handling this the right way instead of the other way. Go home, Victor. Let the audit run. If I'm wrong about what I think I found, I'll stand in front of every person in this organization and say so. Victor looked at him for a long time. You won't like what you find, he said finally. And there was something in his voice that was not quite a threat and not quite a confession, and was somehow worse than either. He walked out. Damian stood in the empty conference room for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Janet Sue. Lock the subsidiary accounts, he said. All of them. Right now. The message that went through Victor's network that afternoon was not subtle, but it was fast. By 3 o'clock, 2 of Damian's captains had received separate calls from men they trusted, men with no obvious connection to Victor Hahn, suggesting that Serena Whitmore had removed sensitive corporate materials during her departure from the Kade estate and was planning to use them in divorce proceedings in a way that could expose the organization's financial structures to outside scrutiny. By 4:30, a third captain, a man named Roy Cheng, who had worked with Damian for 9 years and liked Serena genuinely, had always liked her, thought she was the steadiest person in the Kade orbit, called Damian directly. I'm getting noise, Roy said. About Serena. What kind of noise? The kind that sounds like it's coming from somewhere organized. Roy paused. Someone's framing this as a disgruntled wife situation, saying she took records that could blow back on all of us, saying she needs to be... Another pause. Managed. Damian's hand tightened on the phone. Managed, he repeated. That's the word being used. Who used it? The call came through Eddie Park. But Eddie Park doesn't originate anything, Damian. He repeats things. Damian walked to his office window. 14 floors down, Chicago moved in its ordinary afternoon rhythm, and he stood there and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, the specific vertigo of understanding that something he had built and trusted had been hollowed out underneath him without his knowledge. Listen to me very carefully, he said. Nobody touches Serena. Not a phone call, not a car following her, not someone standing outside her sister's building. Nothing. You tell Roy, you tell Eddie, you tell anyone who's been called Serena Whitmore is off limits. Those are my words, not a message, my words. Understood. Roy sounded relieved. What do I tell them about the records? Tell them there are no records that concern them. Damian paused. And find out who made the call to Eddie Park before Eddie Park made it to Roy. I'll find out. Damian ended the call. He stood at the window for another moment. Then he called his head of security, a man named Briggs, not the paralegal, a different Briggs, and told him to put 2 people on Serena's sister's house. Not surveillance. Protection. Difference being, they were to keep Victor's people away from her, not report back on what she was doing. Briggs asked no questions. He said yes and ended the call. Damian understood now what he was dealing with. Victor had not panicked. Victor had activated. The moment Damian mentioned the audit in that conference room, Victor had begun executing a contingency plan, which meant the contingency plan had been prepared in advance, which meant Victor had anticipated exactly this scenario, which meant Victor had known this day was coming for longer than Damian wanted to calculate. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop and looked at the most recent email from Janet Sue's team. The email contained one line. The irregularities in the Northgate accounts are not limited to 16 transactions. We are finding additional structures. We'll call you at 6 p.m. Damian read the line 3 times. He closed the laptop. He picked up the pen Marcus had left on his desk 2 days ago and turned it between his fingers. 12 million was the number Serena's emails had mentioned. 12 million over 22 months. He had thought, when he read it, that 12 million was a number designed to hurt an organization without killing it enough to fund an alternative operation, not so much that the loss would trigger immediate scrutiny. If there were additional structures, his phone rang. He answered without looking at the screen. Mr. Kade, a voice he did not recognize. Male, 50s, the flat affect of someone who delivered professional bad news for a living. My name is Anthony Marsh. I'm a federal investigator with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I wonder if you have a few minutes to speak about some transaction activity associated with your subsidiary accounts. The room was very quiet. I'll have my lawyer call you, Damian said. Of course. I'd just like to mention that we've been watching certain account structures connected to entities associated with Kade Meridian for approximately 8 months. We're not at this point contacting you as a subject. We're contacting you as someone whose credentials appear to have been used without his authorization. A pause. It would benefit you to respond promptly. Damian ended the call. He sat very still. Federal investigators did not call you at 4:50 in the afternoon on a Wednesday unless they had been building towards something for a long time and had decided the time for courtesy was narrowing. 8 months. They had been watching for 8 months, which meant the investigation into the accounts predated Serena's meeting with David Reyes, which meant someone or something, some transaction, some data flag had already drawn federal attention to the structures Victor had built, and Victor had known. Victor had known federal attention was approaching, which was why the timeline had accelerated, which was why the warehouses were already in position, which was why the plan to absorb Damian's legitimate business was already operational. Victor wasn't just planning to replace him. Victor was planning to disappear before the collapse and let Damian carry the weight of it. Damian stood up. He walked to the window again and looked at Chicago and understood, in the specific way that things become clear when there is no more room to not understand them, that he had spent 12 years building a world on top of a fault line he had refused to see because the person who kept pointing at the ground was someone he had stopped listening to. His phone buzzed. A text from Dana Whitmore's number, Serena's sister, who had never texted him in 12 years of marriage. It said, "She's fine, but you should know 2 men in a gray sedan have been parked outside my house since 2 o'clock. They're not yours." Damian was already reaching for his jacket before he finished reading the text. He called Briggs. "The gray sedan outside the Whitmore residence on Paulina Street." "I see it," Briggs said. "My people have eyes on it. 2 men, engine running. Haven't moved. I want to know who they belong to in the next 30 minutes. Working on it. And Briggs if they move toward the house." "They won't," Briggs said, with the calm of a man for whom preventing things from happening was a professional identity. Damian put on his jacket and walked out of the office. In the elevator, descending, he thought about the last thing Victor had said to him in that conference room. You won't like what you find. Not a denial. Not an explanation. Not even a deflection. A warning. The elevator reached the lobby, and the doors opened and Damian walked through and into the cold, ordinary, unforgiving Chicago afternoon. And he understood that whatever this had been before today, a suspicion, an investigation, a marital collapse, a financial irregularity, it was something else now. It was a war. And the woman he had failed for 12 years, the woman currently sitting in her sister's house with a gray sedan stand parked outside and a leather case containing the only map that led out of this, she had seen it coming long before he had. The question now was not whether Damian could win. The question was whether he could earn the right to fight in the direction she had already been pointing. He got into his car. He did not drive to Serena's sister's house. She did not need him showing up. She had made that clear without using any words about it at all. Instead, he drove to the office of a lawyer he used for situations that required complete discretion. A woman named Christine Hale, who had represented him 3 times and kept a secret like she had personally buried it. And he sat in her office at 5:30 in the afternoon and told her everything. Christine listened without interrupting. She took notes in handwriting, so small, it looked like a different language. When he finished, she set her pen down. The federal contact, she said. Read me the name again. Anthony Marsh. Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Christine wrote it down. And you've already locked the subsidiary accounts. Since this afternoon. Good. Don't unlock them for anything or anyone until I've spoken with FinCEN directly. She tapped her pen against the notepad. The independent audit you commissioned Janet Sue? Yes. She's solid. Keep her working. Christine looked at him directly. Damian. The ledger. What about it? If it says what you think it says, if the metadata holds up and the authentication is clean, that ledger is the most important document in this situation. Not for destroying Victor, for protecting you. She paused. Does Serena understand that? Damian looked at her. Serena, he said slowly, has probably understood that for longer than either of us have been thinking about it. Christine nodded once. Then the best thing you can do right now is stay completely out of her way and let her work. He drove home in the dark. The house was quiet in the particular way. It had been quiet since Serena left, not peaceful quiet, but empty quiet, the kind of quiet of the specific noise that used to fill a space. He poured himself a drink he didn't finish and stood in the kitchen and thought about 12 years of mornings where Serena had been at her desk at 5:30 and she was managing, she was household, and she had actually been managing his empire. He thought about the 14 emails. He thought about the gray sedan on Paulina Street. His phone buzzed. Briggs. The sedan, Briggs said. Plates traced to a leasing company. Leasing company's records show the vehicle rented to an individual named Carl Weston. Carl Weston is a private investigator whose largest client over the past 3 years, according to his business registration, is a firm called Pacific Meridian Consulting. Damian waited. Pacific Meridian Consulting, Briggs continued, shares a registered business address with HV Capital Advisors. The line was silent for a moment. Victor Hahn sent surveillance to watch Serena Whitmore, Damian said. Yes, sir. Damian set his glass down on the counter. Pull them, he said. Whatever it takes. Already in motion. He ended the call. He stood in his kitchen in the quiet, dark house and understood that the point he had been approaching the point from which there was no version of going back to how things were. No version where this resolved itself quietly, and the organization survived intact, and Victor was simply removed, and Serena was simply compensated, and Damian was simply chastened, but essentially unchanged. That point was not ahead of him. He had already passed it. He just hadn't known it until now. The man who walked into that conference room this morning and asked Victor Hahn about the Lakeview authorizations was already a different man than the one who had stood at the head of an anniversary dinner table and given his wife's work away to someone else. That man no longer existed. What came next, the audit, the federal investigators, the war with Victor, the reckoning with his own board, the question of what Kade Meridian was and what it was going to become was not going to be survived by the old version of Damian Kade. The old version had been maintained, in large part, by a woman who was no longer willing to maintain him. He turned off the kitchen light and walked upstairs in the dark. On the dresser, the space where the Portugal photograph had stood was still empty. He looked at it for a moment. Then he went to bed, because tomorrow was going to be the kind of day that required him to be awake for it. And for the first time in a very long time, he intended to face it, without anyone standing between him and what was coming. Janet Sue called at 6 o'clock, exactly. Damian was already at his desk when the phone rang, coffee untouched, the folder from Christine Hale's office open in front of him. He had slept 4 hours. He knew because he had watched the ceiling for the other 4, running numbers he didn't fully understand through a mind that kept returning to the same question, how long? How long had Victor been building underneath him? How long had the floor been compromised while he walked across it every morning believing it was solid? Talk to me, he said. Janet Sue had a voice like a ruler flat, precise, no wasted length. We've completed the initial pass on the subsidiary structures. I need you to be sitting down. I'm sitting. The Northgate transfers are not the primary vehicle. They're a layer. Beneath Northgate, there are 3 additional shell entities, Hallmark Processings LLC, Blue Ridge Corridor Partners, and an offshore structure registered in the Cayman Islands, under a name I'm going to have my analyst send you in writing because I don't want to say it on a phone call. Damian picked up his pen. How much? Across all 4 structures, over a period we're currently estimating at between 6 and 8 years. A pause. Not a dramatic pause. A Janet Sue pause, which meant she was making sure she had the right number before she said it. Approximately $31 million. The pen stopped moving. Say that again. 31 million. That's a conservative figure based on what we've confirmed. There may be additional structures we haven't fully mapped yet. Another pause. Damian. The Northgate transfers Serena flagged were not the main event. They were the part he let get a little sloppy because he needed you looking at a $12 million problem so you wouldn't look for a $31 million one. Damian set the pen down. He looked at the wall across from his desk. There was a framed photograph there, the Cade Meridian headquarters building on the day it opened, his father standing at the entrance with his hand on Damian's shoulder. Victor Hahn, 2 steps behind them both, smiling. Damian had walked past that photograph every working day for 11 years without thinking about it. The offshore entity, he said. The name. Checking my email now, Janet said. There was a brief silence. Elias K. Foundation. The room went very still. Damian heard his own breathing. He used my father's name, he said. The entity was registered 8 years ago. That would place it approximately 18 months after Chairman Elias Cade's initial diagnosis. Janet's voice had gone slightly quieter, which for her was the equivalent of another person sitting down and putting a hand on your arm. I'm sorry. I know this is going. The Elias K. Foundation received transfers from the other 3 shell entities over a 6-year period. It also received 2 direct transfers from Cade Meridian's charitable giving arm, which were documented internally as donations to a medical research initiative in Chairman Cade's name. Those transfers were real, Damian said. His voice sounded odd to him. Too controlled. I approved those donations myself. They went to the Northwestern Endowment. Half of them did, Janet said. The other half went to the foundation. The split happened at the processing level after your authorization. Before the wire cleared, someone with access to the payment infrastructure adjusted the destination account on the back end. Damian stood up. He did it without deciding to. His body just rose from the chair because sitting still had become physically impossible. He walked to the window. 14 floors down, the city was beginning its morning delivery, trucks, early commuters, the ordinary indifferent machinery of Chicago doing what it always did. He stole from my father's memorial donations, Damian said. Yes, while my father was dying. The entity was registered during his illness. The first transfers occurred. Janet stopped. Yes, while he was still alive. Damian pressed his hand flat against the cold glass of the window. He had a memory, sudden and specific and completely uninvited. His father in a hospital bed the last year, the way Elias Cade had held Damian's hand, with a grip that was still surprisingly strong, even when everything else had become fragile. The way his father had said, Victor will help you. He's been with this family longer than you've been alive. Trust him the way I trust him. The way Damian had nodded and meant it completely, and walked out of that hospital room carrying the weight of an organization he was about to inherit, and feeling, underneath the grief, a specific and shameful relief that he would not have to carry it alone. He had trusted Victor because his dying father told him to, and Victor had named a theft vehicle after the dying man, Damian. Janet's voice was careful. I need to tell you one more thing. He waited. The delegation of authority document Victor showed you yesterday, the one that authorizes use of your credentials for subsidiary transactions, my analyst, compared the signature on that document with 5 other documents bearing your signature from the same period. A brief pause. The signatures don't match. Not in the way signatures naturally vary. In the way a signature matches when someone who is very good at replicating handwriting gets most of it right, but misses the specific pressure pattern in the downstroke. The glass was very cold under his palm. It's forged, he said. I can't say that definitively until we've had a handwriting specialist review it. But yes, my strong preliminary read is that you never signed that document. Damian lowered his hand from the window. He turned back to the room. The photograph on the wall, his father's hand on his shoulder. Victor Hahn 2 steps behind them, smiling. How long until you can put this in a formal report? 2 days for the preliminary. Complete findings in 5. I need the preliminary in 36 hours. A brief silence. I'll need to bring in one more analyst, do it. He paused. Janet, is there anything in what you've found that creates exposure for me personally? Criminal exposure. She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. The credential use is in your name. That's the mechanism Victor if built this ever came apart. The transfers traced back to your authorization codes. If we hadn't found the forged document and the travel records, if Serena hadn't been building the metadata case for 14 months, he was going to let it land on me. That was always the exit strategy, Janet said quietly. You go down for the transfers. Victor walks. The alternative business structure absorbs what's left. Damian sat back down. He sat in the chair and looked at the ceiling and breathed. He thought about the federal investigators' call yesterday afternoon. We're not at this point contacting you as a subject. Not yet. Not yet was doing a lot of work in that sentence. They had been watching the accounts for 8 months. If Victor had continued, if Serena had not started building the ledger, if she had not come to David Reyes, if the audit had not happened, the federal case would have assembled itself around Damian Kade's name, and Victor Hahn would have been, at most, a cooperating witness. He picked up his phone and called Christine Hale. She answered on the second ring. The federal contact, he said. Anthony Marsh. I need you to call him today and set up a meeting. Not on the phone. In person. What changed overnight? The number is 31 million, and he used my father's name to do it. Damian paused, and the delegation document is forged. My handwriting, not my signature. Christine was silent for a moment. I'll have Marsh in a room by end of business tomorrow, she said. Serena found out about the 31 million from David Reyes, who found out from a contact at a competing forensic firm, whose analyst had been quietly brought in by Janet Sue that morning. The world of forensic financial investigation in Chicago was not large, and significant discoveries moved through it the way cold moves through a house through the gaps, faster than you expect. She was at Dana's kitchen table when David called. She listened. She did not speak until he finished. The Elias K. Foundation, she said, registered in the Caymans, named for Damian's father. Serena put her coffee mug down very carefully, as though the surface of the table required her full attention. She had not known about the foundation. She had found 3 shell entities in her 14 months of investigation, Northgate and 2 others, and she had believed, based on everything she could document, that the total exposure was in the range of 12 to 15 million. She had not found the offshore layer. She had not found the charitable giving manipulation. She sat with that for a moment. She had been thorough. She was always thorough. The fact that Victor had constructed a layer she had not reached in 14 months of careful investigation meant that the structure was more sophisticated than she had understood, which meant Victor Hahn was either smarter than she had given him credit for, or he had help she had not identified. David, she said, the charitable giving arm. Who processes those transfers internally? At Cade Meridian, I'd have to check. Check today. Because if someone adjusted a destination account after Damian's authorization cleared, that's not Victor working alone. That's Victor with access to the payment processing infrastructure, which means either he had a technical collaborator inside the finance department or someone in the finance department was his. Before the finance department was Damian's, David said. Find out who has handled charitable transfer processing for the last 8 years. On it, she ended the call. Dana came into the kitchen from the hallway, wearing a bathrobe, carrying the specific expression of a woman who has been listening to her sister conduct financial forensics at 7 in the morning and has decided not to comment on it directly. More coffee? Dana said. Please. Dana poured. She set the mug down and leaned against the counter. How bad is it? Serena looked at her. Dana had been her older sister for 41 years and could read Serena's face the way Serena could read a balance sheet, not every number, but the overall picture, the trend, whether healthy or bleeding. Bad, Serena said, but manageable. If the right things happen in the right order, and if the wrong things happen. Serena picked up her mug. Then we find out how good the forensic case actually is. The meeting happened because nobody planned it. Serena needed to retrieve a specific set of banking records that David's office did not have original transaction logs she had stored in a secure cloud partition that required her to authenticate in person at a financial services firm on Michigan Avenue. She had called ahead. She had a 9:30 appointment. She did not know that Damian had a meeting in the same building at 9:15 with a private banking contact. One of the calls Christine Hale had arranged the previous evening. She saw him in the lobby. He saw her at the same moment. They stood approximately 30 feet apart, separated by the morning foot traffic of a Michigan Avenue office tower. And for a moment, neither of them moved. He looked terrible. She registered that with the specific clarity that comes from years of knowing someone's face well, not terrible. In the way men looked when they had been drinking or hadn't slept, but terrible in the particular way of someone who has received information that has changed the shape of something they believed was fixed, hollowed out. Still functioning, still standing. Tie straight and jacket buttoned, but hollowed. She probably did not look much better. He crossed the lobby to her. He did not rush. He moved the way Damian always moved in public spaces, with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who understood that how you covered distance said something about who you were. He stopped 2 feet from her. I'm not here to... He started. I know, she said. A beat of silence. 31 million, he said quietly. He used my father's name. Serena looked at him. I didn't know about the foundation. I want you to know that. What I found stopped at 3 entities. I missed the offshore layer. Something moved across his face. Not relief. Something more complicated than relief. You warned me about what you found. Whatever you missed. I should have pushed harder, Serena. His voice was very low. You sent me 14 emails. She looked away. The lobby moved around them, people with briefcases, coffee cups, lanyards, the ordinary business of the city. The charitable transfer processing, she said. I need to know who handles it internally. A woman named Carol Pham. She's been in the finance department for 9 years. Did Victor hire her? Damian was quiet for a moment. Victor recommended her. I signed off. Serena nodded once. She already knew the answer. She had known it from the way David had framed it on the phone, someone with access to the payment infrastructure, but she had needed to hear it confirmed. She may have been his before she was yours, Serena said. Damian's jaw tightened. How many people? I don't know yet. That's what I'm trying to find out. She shifted the bag on her shoulder. Your audit is running. Janet Sue. Preliminary in 36 hours. Talk to Christine Hale about Finson before the preliminary lands. If federal investigators are building a case around your credential use, you want to be ahead of their timeline, not catching up to it. Already in motion. He paused. Serena. There are 2 men. I know about the sedan, she said. Your people moved them last night. They were Victor's, I assumed. Another silence. The lobby noise filled the space between them, elevator chimes, phone conversations, the revolving doors cycling in cold air from outside. Are you safe? He said. It was the first thing he had said in 12 years that landed on her with the specific weight of something true, an unmanaged no calculation in it, no strategy, just the raw question underneath everything else. She looked at him for a moment. I'm careful, she said, which was not the same thing, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. She walked past him toward the elevator bank. He watched her go. Victor Hahn did not go home. He drove to a property in Evanston that was registered to a family trust established in his wife's maiden name, a practice he had maintained For 22 years, long before he had any specific reason to need it. He had always operated this way. Every significant thing he owned had a layer between it and his name. Not because he anticipated wrongdoing, he would have said, if anyone had asked. Because he understood how the world worked. He sat in the kitchen of the Evanston property and made 3 phone calls. The first was to Franklin Moore, his attorney. "They've locked the subsidiary accounts," Victor said. "I heard." Franklin's voice had the particular tightness of a lawyer who has just discovered that a situation he was advising on has become significantly more serious than disclosed. "Victor, if the Finson contact Damian received is real, it's real, then we have a window, a narrow one. The authentication process for the offshore structures takes time. If we can move certain assets before the freeze propagates to the Cayman entity." "That window closed this morning," Victor said. "Damian's auditor is already working. She'll find the foundation within 24 hours. Silence on the line. "Then we need to talk about your options," Franklin said carefully. "My options are limited," Victor said, "which is why I'm calling to discuss yours." A pause. "You processed 3 of the Northgate transfer documents. You notarized 2 of the authorization forms. Your name is in the chain, Franklin." The line went very quiet. "If this unravels in the direction it's heading," Victor continued, "investigators will find your signature on documents that you knew were irregular when you signed them. I am giving you the opportunity to think carefully about whose version of events serves you better." Franklin hung up. Victor set the phone down. He was not panicked. He had been in difficult situations before, situations where the ground shifted and the people around him began calculating their own survival. He understood the mechanics of it. Fear made people predictable. They moved toward whoever seemed most likely to protect them from consequences, and they moved away from whoever seemed most likely to pull them under. The question was which direction his people moved. His second call was to Roy Cheng. Roy did not answer. He tried twice, voicemail both times. Roy Cheng, who had worked adjacent to Victor for 9 years, who had always called back within 20 minutes, who Victor had used a dozen times as a pass-through for sensitive communications. Roy Cheng was not answering his phone, which told Victor something he needed to know. He made his third call. The man who answered went by a name that was not his real name, which was fine, because Victor had known his real name for 20 years. He ran private investigation operations, and when the situation required, rather more direct services. "I need information on the current status of the Whitmore woman's investigation," Victor said. "What she has, who she's shared it with, and where the primary documentation is physically located. That's going to require closer access than we currently have," the man said. "Your people were pulled from the Paulina Street address last night." "I know. Find another approach. This kind of access has a different price point. I'm aware of what things cost," Victor said. He ended the call. He sat in the kitchen of the Evanston property and looked out the window at the backyard dormant grass, a bare oak tree, a sky the color of old concrete. He had been building toward this exit for 8 years. 8 years of careful, patient, incrementally constructed alternative. He had built it so that when the time came, he'd step sideways out of Cade Meridian's structure before it collapsed out and land on something solid. The problem was the ledger. Serena Whitmore's ledger did something that none of Victor's contingency planning had accounted for, because Victor had not believed, for most of those 8 years, that Serena would have the specific combination of skills, patience, and motivation to build it. He had underestimated her the way men in his world tended to underestimate the women who occupied roles adjacent to power rather than positions of power. He had seen her as a capable accountant who kept the legitimate books clean and kept Damian's domestic life organized. He had not seen her as someone who would spend 4 years quietly, documenting the architecture of a betrayal. The ledger connected the structures. Without it, the individual entities were discoverable, but not easily connectable. With it, with the forensic timeline Serena had built, the authorization code analysis, the metadata, the whole picture assembled itself clearly enough that a federal investigator could present it to a grand jury. And Serena had given it to David Reyes, which meant it was no longer in one location that could be managed. Victor pressed his hands flat on the kitchen table. He was 67 years old. He had operated in spaces that did not tolerate mistakes for 4 decades. He had survived 3 federal investigations, 2 rival power restructurings, and the transition between two generations of Kade leadership. He was not a man who panicked. He was not a man who made emotional decisions. But he was a man who understood timing, and the timing was collapsing. He picked up his phone and called Franklin Moore again. Franklin answered this time. "I need the injunction filed today," Victor said. "Victor, I just told you. The injunction's against the ledger. Claim corporate property, improper removal, confidentiality violation. I don't care what the legal theory is. I need the ledger tied up in a dispute for 48 hours. Even if I file it today, Serena's attorneys will have a response filed within 48 hours, Victor repeated. That's all I need." Franklin was quiet for a moment. The quiet of a man doing arithmetic about his own risk. "I'll file it," he said. Serena's phone rang at 2:17 in the afternoon. "David Reyes." She answered before the second ring. "The injunction just landed," David said. His voice had the flat, clipped quality it got when he was managing anger. Victor Hahn's attorney filed a motion claiming the Atlas Ledger constitutes improperly removed corporate property and seeking an immediate suspension of its use in any investigative or legal proceeding pending a hearing. Serena was standing in David's office. She had been there since 11, working through the banking records she'd retrieved that morning. She set down the file she was holding. "How long to respond?" "I've already called your attorney. He says he can have the response filed by end of business. The metadata documentation, the access permissions, the authentication records everything you prepared is exactly what we need to knock this down." David paused. "But Serena, injunctions take time even when they fail. If a judge grants a temporary suspension while the hearing is scheduled, how long? 48 hours minimum. Possibly 72. Serena looked at the wall. 48 hours. Victor needed 48 hours to move assets that were currently frozen in subsidiary accounts. If the injunction created enough legal ambiguity to delay the freeze enforcement, if he could reach the Cayman entity before the federal hold propagated. "He doesn't need to win the injunction," she said. "He just needs to slow us down." Yes, she thought fast. The metadata documentation was thorough. Her access permissions were documented and signed. The authentication of the ledger was clean. Under normal circumstances, the injunction would fail. But normal circumstances included a judge who moved at the standard pace of commercial litigation, which was not fast. "The federal investigators," she said. "Finson, is there a mechanism to present the ledger directly to federal investigators outside the civil injunction process?" David was quiet for a moment. "If the ledger is material to an active federal investigations, it is. They've been watching the accounts for 8 months. If we can establish that the materials are relevant to the federal case, the civil injunction doesn't apply. Federal proceedings preempt it. You'd need the federal investigators to formally request the materials. Then I need to be in a room with the federal investigators today." David said nothing for a moment. "Serena, that means walking into a federal investigation voluntarily. Whatever you share becomes part of their record. You lose control of how it's used. I know, and the metadata proves he didn't authorize the transfers. That's the point." She picked up her bag. "If I let Victor tie up the ledger for 48 hours while an active FinCEN investigation is building a case around Damian's credential use, the narrative solidifies around Damian. Once that happens, the truth becomes harder to establish, not easier." She paused at the door. Victor didn't just steal from Damian. He built this to destroy him. "I'm not going to let a filing delay make that happen." She walked out. In the hallway, she called her attorney and told him to prepare for a federal evidence presentation. He asked her 3 questions. She answered all 3. He said he would make a call. 40 minutes later, she was sitting in a federal building on Dearborn Street, across from Anthony Marsh and a woman named Special Agent Diane Cho, with the Atlas Ledger open on the table between them. Marsh was in his 50s, broad-faced, with the deliberate stillness of someone who had learned to let silence do work for him. Cho was younger, sharper-eyed, the kind of focused that meant she had read everything before this meeting, and was now watching Serena's face rather than the documents. "Mrs. Whitmore," Marsh began. "Whitmore," Serena said. "Just Whitmore." Marsh nodded. "You understand that anything you share with us today becomes part of a federal investigation and may be used in proceedings that you cannot fully anticipate. I understand. And you're here voluntarily. I am." He looked at her for a moment. "Walk us through the ledger." Serena opened the first section. She talked for 2 hours and 14 minutes without stopping, except to answer questions. And Cho asked good questions, precise, specific, the kind that showed she understood financial structures well enough to know which detail mattered. Marsh sat and listened, and occasionally wrote something in his notebook, in handwritings Serena couldn't read from across the table. When she finished, the room was very quiet. "The delegation of authority document," Marsh said, "the one Victor Hahn presented to Damian Kade. His forensic auditor believes it's forged. You'll want your own analysis. We'll want the original." Marsh made a note. "The Elias K. Foundation. You didn't know about this structure. I didn't reach it. I found 3 vehicles. The offshore layer and the charitable transfer manipulation were beyond what I documented. But the metadata you compiled," Cho leaned forward slightly, "establishes the authorization timeline clearly enough that the foundation transfers fall within the same pattern." "Yes." Cho and Marsh exchanged a look that communicated something Serena couldn't read. "Miss Whitmore," Marsh said, "we've been watching the Cade Meridian subsidiary accounts for 8 months. In that time, we've built a significant transaction record. What we have not been able to establish clearly until this morning's documentation from Cade Meridian's own auditor, and now your materials, is the distinction between the account holder as a principal and the account holder as a victim of credential fraud." Serena looked at him. "You're telling me that without the ledger, your case pointed at Damian." "I'm telling you that the ledger changes the picture materially." Marsh closed his notebook. "The injunction Victor Hahn filed this afternoon. That's why I'm here. It won't hold. Federal evidence requests supersede civil proceedings. The ledger stays with us." He paused. "I'd like to ask you one more question, off the official record, for this moment." Serena nodded. "Why?" Marsh said. "You walked out of that marriage. You had every reason to let this fall on him and keep walking." The room was very still. Serena looked at Anthony Marsh for a long moment. "Because what Victor built was designed to destroy a man by making it look like he'd destroyed himself," she said. "And I spent 12 years watching that man make a lot of mistakes. But those were his mistakes. What Victor did." She paused. "Those weren't his mistakes. They were his name on someone else's crime." She closed the ledger. "I'm a forensic accountant. I don't let things get misattributed." Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. Outside the federal building, standing on Dearborn Street in the cold with the city moving around her, Serena called David Reyes. "The ledger is with federal investigators," she said. "The injunction is dead." David let out a breath. "And Victor?" He wanted 48 hours. She pulled her coat tighter. "He's not getting them." She walked toward the parking garage. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just handed it to someone else to carry, not relief exactly, but the unfamiliar sensation of weight redistributed. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost ignored it. She answered. A voice she had never heard before, male, middle-aged, deliberate. "Miss Whitmore, my name is Malcolm Reeve. I was Victor Hahn's attorney for 11 years before I separated from his representation 6 months ago." A pause. "I have correspondence between Victor Hahn and Chairman Elias Kade from the period preceding the authority transfer. I think you need to see it before federal investigators talk to Victor, because what it shows is not just fraud." Serena stopped walking. "What does it show?" she said. "It shows," Malcolm Reeve said carefully, "that Elias Kade believed the authority transfer was temporary, that he was told it was a provisional arrangement during his medical treatment, and that Victor Hahn had documentation prepared and signed by a man who was heavily medicated and legally still capable, but cognitively not, that made it permanent." The parking garage entrance was 10 feet in front of her. She did not move toward it. "Victor didn't just steal from Damian," Malcolm said. "He stole the company from Elias Kade while the man was dying. And he spent the next 15 years making sure Damian never found out. Because a Damian who knew the truth about his inheritance was a Damian who had a reason to look at everything. Victor told him with a different set of eyes." The cold air sat on Serena's face. She thought about Damian standing in that hospital room at 28 years old, holding his father's hand, being told to trust Victor. She thought about everything Damian had been handed and everything he had believed he'd built. She thought about the 12 years she had spent watching a man lead an empire whose foundation had been laid by someone else's betrayal before she even entered the picture, a betrayal so deep and so old that Damian had never had the right information to protect himself from it. Not because he hadn't been paying attention, because the man he trusted most had made sure he never got the chance. "Where are you?" Serena said. "I'm at a coffee shop on Wabash," Malcolm Reeve said. "I've been trying to decide whether to call you for 6 months. This morning I decided." Serena turned away from the parking garage. "I'm 12 minutes away," she said, and started walking. Malcolm Reeve was smaller than his voice suggested. Serena had expected someone with the physical authority that usually came with 11 years of representing a man like Victor Hahn, broad-shouldered, deliberate, the kind of lawyer who filled a room. Instead, she found a man in his late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a coffee cup he'd been nursing long enough for it to go cold, and the specific look of someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally decided that putting it down was worth whatever it cost. He stood when she came through the door. An old-fashioned reflex. She noticed it. She sat down across from him, without taking off her coat. "You said you separated from his representation 6 months ago," she said. "Why?" Malcolm wrapped both hands around his cold coffee cup. "Because 6 months ago I found out the full scope of what I'd been facilitating." He paused. "I'm an attorney, Miss Whitmore. I've represented people who operated in gray areas. That's a choice lawyers make, and I made it with my eyes open. But there's a difference between gray area and what Victor Hahn did to Elias Kade. Show me the correspondence." He reached into a leather briefcase worn at the corners, the kind that had been carried for 20 years, and produced a folder. He set it on the table between them. Serena opened it. The first document was a letter, handwritten, on Kade family personal stationery, dated approximately 9 years ago. The handwriting was shaky in the way that illness makes handwriting shaky. The letters formed correctly, but with the slightly uneven pressure of a hand that had to think about what it was doing. Elias Kade's handwriting. She had seen it on enough documents during her marriage to recognize it. The letter was addressed to Victor Hahn. She read it. Then she read it again. "Victor Dr. Hirsch tells me the provisional arrangement we discussed can be revisited in 6 months once the treatment course is complete. I want to be clear with you and with the board that this is not a permanent transfer. Damian is not ready, and I am not gone. When I am recovered, we will have a proper succession process. I am trusting you to hold this in trust for me until I can resume. Elias." She turned to the second document. It was a board resolution, formally typed, legally formatted, bearing the signatures of 4 board members, and at the bottom a signature line labeled E. Kade Chairman. The date was 3 weeks after the letter. The resolution made the authority transfer permanent and unconditional. Serena looked at the signature. She had seen Elias Kade's signature in documents from his healthy years, strong, decisive, the signature of a man who signed things with the confidence of someone who never doubted his own name. The signature on this resolution had the same shaky, deliberate quality as the handwriting in the letter. He had signed it thinking it was temporary. Victor had presented a permanent resolution to a dying man who trusted him completely, gotten his signature during a window when he was still legally capable of signing but cognitively reliant on being told what he was signing, and filed it with the board as a valid unconditional transfer. Damian had inherited his father's company, believing his father had chosen to give it to him. His father had been trying to hold it for himself until he recovered. He had never recovered. "The 4 board members who signed this," Serena said. "3 of them are no longer on the board. 1 died. 2 retired." Malcolm paused. "The 4th is still sitting." Serena looked up. "Vincent Tao," Malcolm said. The coffee shop noise continued around them, espresso machines, conversation, the door opening and closing with the cold. Serena sat very still in the middle of all of it. Vincent, who had been at the anniversary dinner, who had clapped 3 times for Lena Park's promotion, who had sat across from Damian at 100 meetings over 9 years, and looked at him with the careful, attentive expression of a loyal lieutenant. "He knew from the beginning," Serena said. "He was present when the resolution was signed. I was present. We were both told it was a formalization of an arrangement Elias had approved." Malcolm looked at his hands. "I believed that. I reviewed the letter. Victor showed it to me as proof of Elias's consent, but I was shown a different version, one that described the transfer as permanent. He paused. I found the original letter 6 months ago when I was going through archived files after separating from the representation. Victor had kept a copy. I don't know why he kept it. Maybe he kept everything. Because it was leverage, Serena said. Against anyone who knew too much. Malcolm looked at her. He kept it to use against you if you ever became inconvenient, she said. The fact that you were present at the signing, that your name is on the documentation, that's his insurance. You cooperate, or he lets investigators find evidence that you knowingly facilitated a fraudulent authority transfer. Malcolm's face had the gray, hollowed quality of a man who has just heard his own situations described accurately by someone who has no reason to be gentle about it. Yes, he said. So why come to me now? He was quiet for a moment. Because they put a man outside my daughter's apartment building last week, he said. Not my building. My daughter's. His voice didn't shake, but the muscles in his jaw tightened visibly. She's 26. She teaches elementary school. She doesn't know anything about any of this. He looked up. I've been afraid of Victor Hahn for 6 months. I'm done being afraid of him. Serena closed the folder. She thought fast. The original letter established Elias Kade's actual intent. The board resolution with the forged framing, or rather the fraudulently presented framing, because Victor hadn't forged the signature. He had deceived the signer, established the mechanism. Malcolm Reeve, as a witness to the signing process, willing to testify that he had been shown a different version of the letter, completed the chain. This was not just financial fraud anymore. This was 15 years of a stolen inheritance. She picked up her phone and called Christine Hale. I need you in a room with Anthony Marsh at Finson this afternoon, Serena said, and I need you to bring Damian. Christine paused. What changed? Everything, Serena said. It goes back further than any of us knew, and there's a witness. She looked at Malcolm Reeve. He nodded. Be at the federal building at 4, Serena said, and ended the call. She called Damian herself. He answered on the first ring, which told her he had been waiting for his phone to ring from anyone who had information. I need you to hear something before the federal meeting this afternoon, she said. Not over the phone. A beat of silence. Where I'm sending you an address. She sent it. Then she looked at Malcolm and said, We have about 40 minutes. Malcolm flagged down the server and asked for fresh coffee. Damian arrived in 23 minutes, which meant he had driven in a way that his security team would have found alarming. He came through the coffee shop door and scanned the room with the automatic, involuntary assessment of a man who had spent 30 years walking into spaces and immediately locating the exits and the threats. And his eyes found Serena and then moved to Malcolm and stayed there for a moment before he walked to the table and sat down. He did not take off his coat either, Damian, Serena said. This is Malcolm Reeve. He was Victor Hahn's attorney for 11 years. Damian looked at Malcolm. Malcolm looked back at him with the expression of a man who understood. He was sitting across from someone who had reason to be angry at him and had decided to accept that. Show him, Serena said. Malcolm opened the folder and turned it to face Damian. Damian read the letter. Serena watched his face. She had watched Damian's face process difficult information. Many times over 12 years, watched him absorb bad news about deals, about people, situations that required rapid recalibration. He was good at keeping his face neutral. He had trained himself, over decades, to receive information without broadcasting a reaction, until he had decided what his reaction should be. He could not keep his face neutral now. It wasn't grief exactly, and it wasn't rage exactly, and it was both of those things and something underneath them that had no clean name, the specific devastation of understanding that a foundational belief about your own life has been false, and that the falseness was constructed deliberately by someone you loved. His father had not given him the company. His father had been trying to hold the company for himself. Victor Hahn had taken it from a dying man and handed the empty shell of it to a 28-year-old son who had no idea what he was receiving. Damian set the letter down. His hands were completely steady. That was the thing about him. Serena thought, whatever broke inside him, his hands stayed steady. She had always found that both admirable and slightly frightening. He told me, Damian said. His voice was low and even. At the hospital, my father told me he was proud of me, that he was ready to pass it to me, that he'd spoken to Victor about making sure the transition was handled right. He paused. He thought he was going home. He wrote the letter 3 weeks before he signed the resolution. Malcolm said quietly. He was told the resolution was the provisional arrangement. He was told the paperwork was temporary. He was dying, Damian said. He was still cognitively present, still legally capable. Victor was careful about that he made sure to move while Elias could still sign, because a signature from an incapacitated man can be challenged. A signature from a sick man who trusted his consigliere cannot. Malcolm paused. I'm sorry. I was there. I didn't know what I know now, but I was there, and I signed as a witness, and I'm sorry. Damian did not respond to the apology. He closed the folder. He looked at Serena. Something passed between them in that look, not warmth, not the remnant of old intimacy, but a kind of recognition. The specific recognition of two people who have both just understood something true about the same story. Vincent Tao, Damian said. Still on the board, Serena said. Present at the signing. Damian sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling briefly. A very brief look, then back down. I have a board meeting tomorrow, he said. I know. Victor's going to try to use the board to move against me before the audit reports lands. If he can get enough directors to call for my removal, he creates a governance crisis that delays the federal case and gives him another window. I know, Serena said again. I need to be in that meeting, Damian said. With everything. Serena looked at him. Then we need to make sure the federal meeting this afternoon goes the right way, she said, and that Janet Sue's preliminary report is in your hands before 9 a.m. tomorrow. Damian nodded once. He stood up. He looked at Malcolm Reeve one more time. You'll testify. It was not a question. Malcolm met his eyes. Yes. Damian walked out. The federal meeting lasted 3 hours. Christine Hale sat beside Damian and did not let him answer a single question without a brief, precise nod that meant this one is safe. Anthony Marsh and Diane Cho had clearly spent the afternoon reviewing Serena's materials and the updated findings from Janet Sue's team, because their questions were specific in a way that indicated they were confirming things they already believed rather than fishing. Malcolm Reeve sat across the table from Damian and told his story in the flat, careful voice of a man who understood that accuracy mattered more than self-protection now. He described the signing. He described the version of the letter Victor had shown him. He described the moment 6 months ago when he found the original in the archived files and understood what he had been part of. Marsh listened to all of it without changing his expression. When Malcolm finished, Marsh made a note. Mr. Reeve, he said, the correspondence you've provided, combined with the materials from Miss Whitmore and the preliminary audit findings, gives us a materially different picture of this case than we had 48 hours ago. He paused. I'd like to ask you about your communications with Victor Hahn in the past 72 hours. Malcolm reached into his briefcase and produced his phone. I have transcripts of 2 calls. He attempted contact twice after Mr. Kade suspended him. In both calls, he referenced the signing documentation and made statements I understood as implicit threats regarding my continued cooperation with his version of events. You recorded these calls. Illinois is a one-party consent state. Malcolm set the phone on the table. I started recording 6 months ago. Marsh looked at his partner. Cho was already leaning forward. By the time Serena walked out of the federal building at 7:30 in the evening, the temperature had dropped 11 degrees and her feet hurt, and she had been running on coffee and the specific cold fuel of focused adrenalines since 5:30 that morning. She stood on Dearborn Street and breathed. Damian came out behind her. They stood side by side on the sidewalk without speaking for a moment, which was something they had never really done. In 12 years of marriage, stood together in silence, without one of them filling it. The board meeting is at 9 a.m., he said. I know. Victor is going to have people in that room. I know. I need the preliminary report. Janet Sue said 36 hours from this morning. That's 9 a.m. tomorrow. Serena paused. If she's on schedule. Damian's jaw tightened. She needs to be on schedule. I'll call her. A silence, Serena, he stopped. Started again. What you did today. The federal building. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, she said. You could have let the ledger go through David's office. Let the investigation, Victor's injunction, would have bought him 48 hours. 48 hours was enough. She pulled her coat tighter. I told you. I'm a forensic accountant. I don't let things get misattributed. He looked at her for a long moment. You also saved my name, he said quietly. I saved the accurate record, she said. Your name happens to be on it. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Go home, she said. Sleep if you can. You need to be sharp tomorrow. She walked to her car. He watched her go, which she knew because she could feel it, and did not turn around. Janet Sue called at 11:47 p.m. Damian was at his desk, had been at his desk since 8, working through the board member list. Christine had sent him 12 directors, their tenures, their relationships to Victor, their likely alignments. He had been making notes in the margins, in the blunt practical shorthand he used when he was thinking through a problem he couldn't afford to get wrong. I have the preliminary, Janet said. I'm sending it now. Talk me through it. 31.4 million across 4 vehicles over 8 years. The Elias K. Foundation received 14.2 of that. The forged delegation document, our handwriting specialist reviewed it in the last 2 hours. Her preliminary conclusion is consistent with simulation rather than authentic signature. She'll have a full written analysis by morning. A pause. Damian. The complete picture, the credential use, the shell structures, the foundation, the forged authorization, the charitable transfer manipulation. This is one of the most comprehensive internal fraud schemes I've encountered in 20 years of forensic work. It was built by someone who understood your organization's financial architecture better than most of the people who worked in it. He built it while he was running it, Damian said. Yes, Janet paused again. The preliminary report is 47 pages. The executive summary is 3. I'd suggest you read the executive summary before the board meeting and have the full report available if you need it. I'll read all 47 pages tonight. A brief silence. I know. I wrote them for you. Another pause. For what it's worth, there is nothing in this report that creates criminal exposure for you. The credential use, when viewed in the context of the authentication evidence and the forged delegation document, is clearly unauthorized. You're a victim of this scheme, not a participant. I'm also the man who had 14 warnings and ignored them, Damian said. Janet was quiet. Put that in the report if it's accurate, he said. Negligence and oversight isn't fraud, Janet said carefully. No, he said, but it's something I'll need to account for to the board. He paused. Send the report. He hung up and opened his email. He read the report, all 47 pages. He finished at 2:15 in the morning, made notes on the sections he would reference in the board meeting, and sat for a while in the quiet of his study with the folder in front of him. He thought about his father, not the hospital version, the earlier version. Elias Kade at 60, still running things, the particular way he had of standing at the window of his office and looking at the city with an expression that was not pride exactly, but something more complicated than pride. The sense of a man who understood the weight of what he had built and carried it consciously. His father had been trying to recover. He had trusted the wrong man. It was a terrible and specific comfort to understand that the mistake had not been Elias Kade's alone, that it had been enabled by a decades-long performance of loyalty so consistent and so skilled that the man deceived by it was not weak or blind, he was simply human, and he had believed what he had been given every reason to believe. Damian understood that comfort and did not let himself lean on it. Because the question before him now was not whether his father's mistake was forgivable. It was whether he could walk into a room of 12 directors at 9 o'clock in the morning and do something he had never done in 30 years of running things. Tell the complete truth about where he had failed. Not the version of the truth that protected his position. Not the version that managed the narrative. The actual complete truth, the ignored warnings. The misplaced trust. The 12 years of not listening. The culture of deference that had allowed Victor Hahn to operate inside his organization with impunity. He had spent his entire adult life in rooms where showing weakness was invitation to be destroyed. Tomorrow he was going to show all of it. He did not know if it would work. He did not know if the board would vote to retain him or vote to remove him and hand what remained of the organization to outside administrators who would dismantle it efficiently and without sentiment. He knew that the other version, the version where he walked in and leveraged and threatened and maneuvered, was the version that created more Victor Hans. More men operating beneath the surface, more structures built on fear and loyalty that was really just managed fear. He had run that organization. He was not going to run it anymore. He closed the folder and went to bed at 2:30 set his alarm for 5, and lay in the dark for a while, thinking about nothing in particular, until his body made the decision his brain couldn't and pulled him under. He was at the building at 8:15. Christine Hale was waiting in the lobby with a coffee she handed to him without being asked, which was how he knew she understood exactly what kind of morning this was. Vincent Dow has been in contact with 3 other board members since last night, she said, walking beside him toward the elevator. I don't know what he told them, but I can guess. He's trying to build a removal majority before the meeting starts. Yes. How many does he need? Simple majority. 7 of 12. Christine pushed the elevator button. I count 4 who are solidly with you, 3 who are solidly with nobody, and will go wherever they think is safer. The remaining 5 are variable. Dow and his 3 contacts, and whoever they've gotten to since last night. She looked at him. Damian. If they move for removal before you've had a chance to present, they won't, he said. You don't know? They won't, he said again. Because I'm going to walk in there and speak first. And what I say will make removal the more dangerous option, not the safer one. Christine looked at him. The elevator opened. They got in. You're going to tell them everything, she said. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. That is either the most effective thing you could do, she said, or it hands them the gun. I know, Damian said. The elevator rose. The boardroom was full when he walked in. 12 directors, 2 legal representatives, Janet Sue standing to one side with her laptop. A court reporter Christine had arranged, who sat in the corner with her machine and her neutral expression. The table was long and the chairs were leather and the windows showed a gray Chicago morning that offered no particular opinions about what was about to happen. Sense was sitting 4 seats from the head of the table. He looked at Damian when he walked in. Damian looked back at him. Neither of them said anything yet. Damian sat at the head of the table. He did not button his jacket. He set the 47-page report in front of him and the 3-page executive summary on top of it, and his phone face down beside the folder, and he looked at the 11 other people in the room and let the silence sit. For exactly 3 seconds, long enough to be intentional, short enough not to be theater. Before anyone calls the meeting to order, he said, I'm going to speak, and I'm going to ask everyone in this room to let me finish before they respond, because what I'm going to say is going to require all of it to make sense. He looked at Vincent Tao. Tao's face was smooth and attentive. 9 years of smooth and attentive. The practiced expression of a man who had been performing loyalty long enough that it had become its own kind of face. Damian looked away from him. 8 years ago, Damian said, a man I trusted began systematically stealing from this organization. Not opportunistically, not as a side operation, as a deliberate, architecturally constructed long-term plan to hollow out Kade Meridian from the inside and build a replacement structure in the shadow of everything we created. He paused. The total amount transferred through shell entities over that period is $31.4 million. I am handing out a forensic audit report this morning that documents every transaction, every vehicle, and every authorization. The audit was commissioned by me 3 days ago and conducted entirely independently of any internal department. The room was very still. I want to say something before you read it, Damian continued, because the report will tell you what happened. It won't tell you what I did to allow it to happen. He pressed his hands flat on the table. My wife spent 14 months sending me documented warnings about financial irregularities in the subsidiary accounts. I dismissed every one of them. I dismissed them because I trusted the man she was warning me about more than I trusted her judgment. He paused. I dismissed them because I did not want to believe something that would have required me to look at someone I loved like a father and see a criminal. He could feel the room. The specific quality of 12 people absorbing something and trying to decide what to do with it. That negligence, Damian said, allowed this to continue longer than it should have. It is not fraud on my part. The audit is clear about that the credential use was unauthorized, the delegation document was forged, and the transfers cannot be attributed to my authorization in any meaningful sense. But the negligence was mine. I want to say that in this room, on the record, before any of you vote on anything. He looked around the table. I am also going to tell you something that is not in the report, he said, because it requires a witness who is currently speaking with federal investigators, and the documentation will be formally presented within 24 hours. He let the silence sit for exactly 1 second. The authority transfer from my father to me, 15 years ago, the transfer through which I came to lead this organization was obtained through fraud. My father believed he was signing a temporary provisional arrangement during his illness. He was presented with a permanent, unconditional transfer by the same man who has been stealing from this organization for 8 years. He paused. My father died believing he was going to recover and resume his position. He died not knowing what had been done to him. The room did not move. I am telling you this, Damian said, because you deserve to know the full foundation of what you've been governing. And because I am not going to stand in front of this board and ask for your confidence while withholding information that is material to your decision. He looked at Vincent Dow. Dow's smooth expression had developed a very small fracture around the eyes, where control is hardest to maintain. He was calculating. Damian could see him calculating. Vincent, Damian said, you were present at the signing of the authority transfer resolution. You witnessed it. Your signature is on the documentation. He kept his voice level, even. The voice he used when he had already made a decision and was informing the room rather than consulting it. I'm going to ask you, in front of this board, whether you knew at the time that my father believed the transfer was temporary. The room did not breathe. Dow looked at Damian for a long moment. Then he looked at the table, and Damian understood from that single downward movement that the answer was yes, and that Dow had just understood that the room had understood it too, and that the calculation he had been running since last night had just collapsed. I'd like to speak with my attorney, Dowsa said. Of course, Christine Hale said from her seat against the wall. She had the satisfied stillness of a woman who had correctly predicted exactly this moment. 2 of the directors Dow had contacted were looking at the table. The 3 variable directors were looking at Damian. Damian picked up the executive summary. I'm going to walk you through the findings, he said. And then I'm going to propose a governance restructuring that I want you to vote on today. Independent directors with real authority. External audit processes with board-level reporting. A reporting structure that does not require anyone in this organization to choose between loyalty and accuracy. He paused. I am also going to ask you to vote on whether to retain me under those conditions. A director named Sarah Park, who had been on the board for 6 years and had always been the hardest to read, looked up from the table and said, You're asking us to vote on your own removal? I'm asking you to vote, Damian said, whatever the outcome. I'm done making decisions for rooms by controlling what rooms are allowed to know. Sarah Park looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the executive summary. Around the table, 11 other sets of hands reached for the report. Vincent Dow sat very still with his hands in his lap and said nothing. The court reporter's machine made its small, continuous sound in the corner. Outside the windows, Chicago went about its business in the gray morning, indifferent and enormous and utterly unconcerned with what was being decided in this room, and Damian Kade sat at the head of his table with his hands flat and his jacket unbuttoned, and everything he had spent 30 years protecting laid open on the table in front of 12 people who were now deciding what it was worth. He had never been more afraid in his life. He did not let it show, because some habits were too deep to break in a single morning. But he did not manage the room. He waited. The vote took 4 hours. Not because the outcome was close, exactly, but because 4 hours was how long it took for 12 people who had spent years inside a system built on managed information to process what it felt like to be given all of it at once. They read the report in sections. They asked Janet Sue questions. They asked Christine Hale questions. 2 of them stepped out to call their personal attorneys and came back looking like people who had received confirmation of something they already knew. Vincent Dow sat through the first 90 minutes without speaking. His attorney, a man named Gerald Foss, who had arrived at the 11th floor within 30 minutes of being called, which told Damian everything about how prepared Tao had been for this particular morning, whispering occasionally in his ear. At the 90-minute mark, Gerald Foss said, My client would like to address the board. Your client can address the board after the report has been fully reviewed, Christine said from her seat against the wall. My client has relevant information regarding. After the report, Christine said again. Her voice had the quality of a door closing. Foss subsided. Dow looked at the table. Damian watched him, not constantly, not obviously, but with the peripheral awareness of a man who had spent 30 years reading rooms. Dao was diminishing in real time, not physically, but in the specific way that people diminish when the structure they have been operating inside collapses and they suddenly have no architecture to stand against. He was 61 years old and had spent 9 years on this board as a reliable, attentive, moderately influential presence, and Damian had trusted him as he had trusted most things incompletely, but enough. The question of how much Dao had known, and when, and whether his participation had been active complicity or the more ordinary cowardice of a man who saw something wrong and chose to protect his position rather than say so. That question was for investigators to answer. Damian had already decided he would not be the one to answer it in this room. At the 2-hour mark, Sarah Park asked about the governance restructuring proposal. Damian walked her through it. Independent directors with genuine authority, not the advisory, consultative, carefully managed authority that boards and organizations, like his typically held, but real veto power over financial decisions above a defined threshold. External audit processes reporting directly to the board rather than through the CEO's office. An internal reporting structure that allowed any employee to flag irregularities to an independent oversight committee without routing the report through department heads. This fundamentally changes how this organization operates, said a director named Thomas Wu, who had been on the board for 11 years and had the measured, non-committal quality of a man who had survived by never being the first to move in any direction. Yes, Damian said. You understand that some of these changes will limit your own operational authority. That's the point. Thomas Wu looked at him. You're proposing to give this board real power over your decisions, Wu said. That's not something CEOs typically offer voluntarily. I'm aware, Damian said. I'm offering it because the alternative is what you just read about in 47 pages. An organization where the CEO's authority is so absolute and so insulated that a consigliere can steal $31 million over 8 years, and nobody with the power to stop it ever receives the information. Wu turned a page in the report. The information was received, he said carefully, by you. Yes, Damian said it was, and I didn't act on it. Which is why I'm standing in front of you, proposing a structure that doesn't rely on me acting on things correctly. It relies on a system. Wu set the page down. He looked at Damian for a long moment with the expression of a man encountering something he had not expected and was not entirely sure what to do with. Then he nodded once and went back to reading. The vote on governance restructuring passed 9-2. The 2 dissenting votes were Dao, who voted no with the expression of a man going through the motions because he had nothing left to perform, and a director named Harold Lung, who had been opposed to oversight expansion since before Damian took the chairmanship and remained opposed on principle, which Damian found almost refreshing in its consistency. The vote on Damian's retention came after. Christine had warned him that morning that this was the moment of maximum uncertainty, that director had voted yes on restructuring might still vote to remove him, because restructuring and retention were different questions, because some people believed the right governance structure required new leadership to implement it, because some people who had spent 9 years in this organization had relationships and loyalties that did not fully survive 4 hours of forensic detail. The vote was 7-5. 7 to retain, 5 to remove. Damian looked at the numbers. Christine slid across the table to him. On a folded piece of paper she had tallied them quietly, without ceremony, the way she did everything, and sat with them for a moment. 7-5 was not a mandate. 7-5 was a margin that told you exactly how much you had to prove, and to whom, and it named no enemies, because 5 votes of no confidence in a room of 12 was a message about the size of the job remaining, not a personal attack. He thought his father would have understood that. He stood up. Thank you, he said to the room, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with being politic. Then he looked at Vincent Dao. You'll be receiving a formal request from federal investigators within the next 24 hours, he said. I'd encourage you to cooperate fully. Dazao looked at the table. He said nothing. Gerald Foss put a hand on his arm. Damian picked up his folder and walked out. Victor Hahn was arrested at 4:17 that afternoon. Damian did not hear about it in real time. He was in Christine's office working through the first set of governance documents when his phone buzzed with a text from Roy Cheng. It's done. Federal. They went to the Evanston property. He set the phone down. He sat with it for a moment. Christine looked up from her desk. She read his face. Han? Yes. She nodded once and went back to the documents. There was nothing triumphant about it. Damian had known this was coming, had known it since the federal meeting the previous afternoon, had seen it since Anthony Marsh's expression in that room had shifted from investigative to prosecutorial, but, knowing it was coming, had not made the moment feel the way he might have expected. It felt like the end of something that should have ended a long time ago. He thought about Victor at 67, being walked out of a house in Evanston with the specific indignity of handcuffs. And he thought about 30 years of mornings when that same man had been the first call he made, the first voice he wanted to hear when something went wrong, the presence that made the weight of the organization feel shared rather than solitary. He thought about his father's handwriting on that letter. I am trusting you to hold this in trust for me until I can resume. He picked his pen back up. There were documents to sign. The federal case against Victor Han moved with the particular momentum of an investigation that had been building for 8 months and had just received 3 additional months' worth of corroborating evidence in 48 hours. Anthony Marsh called Christine Hale on Thursday morning and told her formally that Damian Kade had been reclassified from a person of interest to a cooperating victim of credential fraud and that his office would be issuing a statement to that effect. Franklin Moore, Victor's attorney, entered a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors within 72 hours of Victor's arrest. He provided correspondence, transaction records, and testimony about the Northgate documentation that filled in the last remaining gaps in the forensic chain. Malcolm Reeve testified to the fraudulent authority transfer and the original Elias Kade letter. Janet Sue's complete 47-page report was entered into the federal record. The Atlas Ledger was entered as a primary evidentiary document. Vincent Dow resigned from the board on Friday morning, citing personal reasons, in a letter that was 4 sentences long and said nothing true about anything. He retained Gerald Foss and said nothing further publicly. Federal investigators had questions for him that would take considerably longer to resolve. The Cicero and Bridgeport warehouses, Victor's parallel logistics network, the shadow empire he had been building for 8 years, were frozen. The shell entities were placed under federal receivership. The Elias K. Foundation's assets were seized pending the investigation. $31.4 million. 8 years. A dying man's signature on a document he believed was temporary. The price of trusting the wrong person was enormous and specific and would take years to fully calculate. Serena heard about the arrest from David Reyes, who called her at 4:45 while she was still in his office, working through the final authentication documentation the federal investigators had requested as a supplement to the ledger. She set her pen down. Okay, she said. David looked at her. That's it? Okay? She thought about it. I've been building toward this for 14 months, she said. It doesn't feel the way I thought it would. How does it feel? She looked at the window. Outside, the Chicago afternoon was doing what Chicago afternoons did in early winter, going gray and cold and faintly hostile in the specific way of a city that does not coddle anyone. Like putting a file in the cabinet, she said. Closed. Done. On to the next one. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the work you did on this, Serena, the 14 months, the metadata, the authentication structure, the way you anticipated Victor's injunction strategy and got ahead of it. He paused. You should be doing this professionally. She looked at him. You've been doing it for free for 12 years, he said. For one client who didn't appreciate it. You could be doing it for clients who pay you and need you and know what they have. He picked up his coffee. I'm serious. I could use a partner with your specific skill set, or if you want to build something of your own. Something of my own, she said. The word sat differently than she expected. She had thought about it in the abstract, in the way you think about things when you are too busy managing a crisis to make real plans. But hearing David say it out loud, in his cluttered office with its dented filing cabinet and its whiteboard full of numbers, made it feel less like an abstract and more like a door. Let me think about it, she said. Think fast, David said. I have 3 cases that need exactly what you do and nobody doing it. She did not move back to the Kade estate. That had never been a question. Dana's guest room had served its purpose 2 weeks of it, which was long enough for the acute phase of everything to pass, and long enough for Serena to understand that what she needed now was not her sister's kindness, but her own space. She found an apartment in Lincoln Park, 2 bedrooms, a study with good light, on the 4th floor of a building that had a doorman she did not know, a neighbor she had not yet met, and no history attached to any wall of it. She moved in with 3 boxes and the leather case and a coffee maker. Dana helped her unpack. They worked mostly in silence, the comfortable silence of 2 women who have known each other long enough that silence is not awkward, but is instead its own form of conversation. At one point, Dana held up a framed photograph of Serena at 32, laughing at something, a beach in Portugal in the background, and said, "This one?" Serena looked at it. "Yes," she said, "that one goes up." Dana hung it in the study above the desk. Serena stood in the doorway of the study. Later that evening, after Dana had gone home, and looked at the photograph for a moment. She looked younger than she remembered feeling at 32. She had been happy that day in Portugal, genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy, in the way that does not know itself as happiness until later. She had not yet begun keeping the ledger. She had not yet started noticing the first signs of what Victor Hahn was doing beneath the surface. She had been a woman on a beach who loved her husband and believed in the future she was building with him. She did not regret that woman. That woman had done 12 years of work that mattered. Some of it was protecting a man who didn't deserve all of it. Some of it was building something real, the expansion division, the forensic case, the life skills of a person who can sit across from federal investigators and present 47 pages of evidence without her voice shaking. Both things were true. She was done sorting them. She went to bed. She slept 8 hours for the first time in weeks. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in a lawyer's office on Wacker Drive. It was not a contentious process. Damian had offered, through Christine, a settlement that was generous property, compensation for years of work, a figure that acknowledged the specific and quantifiable value of what Serena had contributed to Kade Meridian's expansion. Christine had presented it to Serena's attorney with a note that said the offer was not a negotiating position, but a number Damian had arrived at independently and considered accurate. Serena's attorney had called her to discuss it. "He's offering more than you'd get in a contested proceeding," her attorney said. "I know," Serena said. "Do you want to counter?" She thought about it. "Tell him I'll accept what legally belongs to me," she said. "Half the marital assets as calculated under Illinois law. No additional compensation." Her attorney was quiet for a moment. "Serena, he's offering significantly more than—" "I know what he's offering," she said. "I don't want to be paid for 12 years of being invisible. I want what the law says I'm owed. Not $1 more." Her attorney filed the response. Damian's attorney called back within an hour and said that Damian had accepted without objection and understood the distinction Serena was drawing. So on a Tuesday morning, they sat on opposite sides of a conference table in a lawyer's office and signed papers, and the 12 years of Serena Whitmore's marriage to Damian Kade became a legal past tense. There were no theatrics. Damian signed where indicated without comment. Serena signed where indicated without comment. Their attorneys exchanged copies. The notary notarized. When it was done, Damian looked across the table at her. He looked different than he had at the anniversary dinner, not older, not defeated, but different in the specific way of someone who has been through a process that has rearranged something internal. The smoothness was still there, the controlled surface, but underneath it was something she had not seen, something that was not managing itself. "I want to say something," he said. She waited. "Not an argument," he said. "Not a case for anything. Just something I want to say." He looked at his hands briefly. "I spent 12 years in a marriage with someone who was smarter than me about most of the things that mattered, and I spent those 12 years making her feel like that was a problem." The room was quiet. "It wasn't a problem," he said. "It was the only reason any of it held together as long as it did." Serena looked at him. She thought about 12 years. She thought about the ledger. She thought about a beach in Portugal and a woman who had not yet started keeping records. "I know you know that now," she said. "I'm glad you know it." She paused. "I hope you keep knowing it after today, because today is the easy part." "I know. The next part is every day after this one." "I know that too." She picked up her copy of the documents and put them in her bag. She stood up and extended her hand across the table. He looked at it for a moment. Then he stood and shook it, A real handshake, firm and brief, the kind between two people who respect each other and are not pretending the respect is something warmer. "Good luck with the board," she said. "Good luck with whatever comes next," he said. She walked out. In the elevator going down, she stood alone with the documents in her bag and the particular sensation of a weight redistributed, not gone, not entirely, but reorganized into something she had chosen to carry rather than something that had accumulated on her without her consent. The elevator opened. She walked out into the ordinary Tuesday morning of Chicago in winter, and the cold hit her face, and she breathed it in. Whitmore and Monroe Integrity Partners opened its doors on a Monday morning 4 months later. The Monroe was Dana, who had spent 15 years as a commercial litigator and whose skill set complemented Serena's in the specific way that a good partnership requires different enough to cover more ground, similar enough to speak the same language. Dana had suggested the name, and Serena had agreed to it on the condition that her name came first, which Dana found funny and agreed to immediately. The office was on the 7th floor of a building in the West Loop, 2 blocks from the federal courthouse, which Serena had chosen deliberately. Windows were large. The desks were good. The filing system was Serena's own design, which meant it was precise in a way that took newcomers 3 days to learn, and then they never wanted to work with anything else. Their first 3 clients came through David Reyes, who sent them with the specific endorsement of a man who does not give endorsements lightly. The 4th came through a referral from a family office, whose patriarch had read about the Hahn case in the financial press and wanted an independent forensic review of his own organization's subsidiary structures. The 5th came through someone who had known Serena for years and had been waiting, without exactly knowing it, for her to be available to help. By the end of the first month, they had more work than they had capacity for. Serena hired 2 analysts. She had business cards made that said her name, her title, her phone number, and the firm's address. She kept them in the front pocket of her bag. Every time she handed one to someone, there was a small private moment of something she did not name, but felt completely the specific sensation of a person taking up space that belongs to them. Damian dismantled the corrupt architecture of Kade Meridian over the following year in the way that structural work always happens, slowly, expensively, without the satisfying drama of sudden transformation. Independent directors with real authority attended meetings and asked uncomfortable questions, and occasionally voted against him, which he had promised he would tolerate and did tolerate. Imperfectly, because tolerating it imperfectly was still tolerating it, and he was no longer holding himself to the standard of the man he had been before. The legitimate businesses were formally separated from the criminal infrastructure. The process was long and legally intricate and required cooperation with federal authorities that Damian provided in full, which cost him relationships he had held for decades, and simplified his world considerably. He cleared his father's record. This was the piece that took the longest and mattered the most to him personally. He worked with Christine and with Malcolm Reeves' testimony and with the original Elias Kade letter, which federal investigators returned to him as a certified copy. Once the case concluded to formally document that the authority transfer had been fraudulently obtained, it had no legal consequence for Damian's own position, which had been confirmed by the board and then reconfirmed in the governance restructuring process. But it existed now as a true record. Elias Kade had not chosen to step down. He had been maneuvered out by a man he trusted while he was dying in a room where he believed everyone was acting in his interest. Damian kept the certified copy of the letter in the top drawer of his desk. He did not display it. He did not need to. He knew what it said. Victor Hahn pled guilty to federal fraud charges 14 months after his arrest, in a deal that reduced his sentence from what prosecutors had sought, but included full asset forfeiture and a permanent bar from any fiduciary position. He was 68 years old at sentencing. His attorney made statements about his age and his health. The judge was not unmoved but was not swayed. Franklin Moore lost his law license and received a suspended sentence in exchange for his cooperation. Vincent Tao settled civil charges for breach of fiduciary duty, paid a fine that was significant without being ruinous, and did not return to any board in any capacity. He retired to a property in Arizona that his wife had owned for years. Nobody from the Kade organization called him. The gray sedan never appeared outside Dana's house again. 1 year after the anniversary dinner, Damian drove to the West Loop on a Thursday afternoon and parked on the street outside Whitmore and Monroe Integrity Partners and sat in his car for a moment. He was not entirely sure why he had come. He had called first, which was the first indication that something had changed in him. 12 months ago, he would not have called first. Would have assumed his arrival was its own sufficient announcement. He had called and asked if she had 15 minutes, and she had said yes, Thursday at 3, and he had written it in his calendar the way he wrote every appointment, and then had spent 3 days wondering if it was a mistake and had come anyway, because wondering if something was a mistake was not a reason to not do it. He went inside. The lobby was clean and quiet, with the particular quality of a space that has been organized by someone who knows what they want it to say. The receptionist, a young man with the focused, unhurried manner of someone who had been hired by Serena Whitmore and therefore met an extremely specific professional standard, told him Miss Whitmore would be with him in a moment and offered him coffee. He accepted. He sat in the waiting area. On the wall across from him was a small framed piece, not a photograph, not a certificate, but a typed excerpt mounted simply on white paper. He leaned forward slightly to read it. It said, "The most dangerous place in any organization is the space between what is known and what is said. No attribution." He sat back. Serena came out at 3:02, which meant she had made him wait 2 minutes on purpose, or had been 2 minutes from wrapping up something, and he chose to assume the latter, and was probably wrong. She looked good, not in the dress-for-performance way. She had looked at the anniversary dinner, armored and composed, and performing a version of fine. She looked good in the way of a person who is sleeping enough and eating enough and spending her days doing work that belongs to her. Her posture was the same. She had always stood very straight, but there was something in it that was easier, less braced. "Come on back," she said. He followed her to her office. It was a good office, organized in a way that took him exactly 3 seconds to understand. Was Serena's system. He had seen it, applied to their home office for 12 years, and recognized its logic even in a new space. The desk was clean. The window was large. On the wall above the desk was a photograph he recognized. Serena on a beach in Portugal, laughing, circa 12 years ago. He looked at it. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She sat across from him, not behind the desk, but in the second chair, the one beside the small table she'd put near the window for exactly this kind of meeting. The setup was someone who had thought about how she wanted to have conversations in her space and arranged accordingly. "How's the board?" she said, "Getting used to disagreeing with me, getting better at it." "Good. The restructuring is..." He paused. "Slower than I expected, better than I feared." She nodded. "The federal case is concluded," he said. "I know. I read the sentencing coverage." "Did you..." He stopped. "Try it again." "How did it feel?" Reading it. She thought about it honestly, which was one of the things he had always respected about her, and had not always appreciated. At the time, she did not answer questions she was not sure about. "Like closing a tab," she said finally. "Something I'd been running in the background. And then it was done, and the background was quieter." He nodded. "The firm is doing well," he said. "Yes. David Reyes told me. I ran into him at a conference last month." He paused. He said, "You're building something serious." "I am," she said. Simply, without qualification. He looked at his hands briefly. He had come with something to say, and he was taking longer to say it than he had intended, which was not typical for him, and he found it mildly annoying. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. She waited. "Leaving forced me to look at what I actually was," he said. "Not the version I'd built for public consumption. What I actually was underneath." He paused. "I wasn't ready to look at it while you were there. I think I always knew you were holding the space between me and it, and I let you, because it was easier." He met her eyes. "You leaving was the most significant thing anyone has ever done for me. I know that's a strange thing to say about a divorce." The room was very quiet. Serena looked at him with the expression she wore when she was reading something complicated, focused, unhurried, committed to understanding it accurately before responding. "I didn't leave for you," she said. "I know. I left because I had been disappearing for 12 years, and I needed to stop." She paused. "The fact that it helped you, I'm glad it did. I genuinely am, but that wasn't why." "I know that too," he said. "I'm not claiming the credit for your decision. I'm just stopped. Trying to say something true without making it about me." She looked at him for a moment. Then something moved across her face, not a smile exactly, but the expression adjacent to one. The expression of someone who has witnessed an improbable but genuine thing. That's progress, she said. He almost smiled, almost. I'm not going to ask you for anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not here to propose something or revisit something or suggest that what happened between us is unresolved. He paused. It's resolved. The divorce is final. You built this. He gestured at the office, the firm, the life outside that window. I'm not here to complicate that. Then why are you here, she said, not unkindly, just directly. He thought about it. Because you deserve to hear from the man you were married to that he understands what you were worth, he said, and what it cost you to be invisible for 12 years, and that the cost was real, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. He paused. You deserved to hear that from him, specifically, not in a lawyer's office, not in a federal building. Just this. The room was quiet for a long time. Outside the window, the West Loop moved through its Thursday afternoon. Serena looked at him. There was something in her expression that he had not seen in years, not warmth, not forgiveness in the easy sense, but something more complicated than either of those things. The expression of a woman who has moved through grief and anger and exhaustion and arrived somewhere on the other side that does not have a clean name, but is solid ground. I know, she said finally. He looked at her. I know you understand it, she said. I can see that you do, and that matters to me. Not because I need it. I don't need it anymore. But because it's true, and true things matter. She paused. Forgiveness doesn't mean coming back. I want you to understand that clearly. I do. And it doesn't mean what happened didn't happen. I know. But I forgive you, she said, for all of it. The 12 years of invisible work, and the dismissed warnings, and the anniversary dinner, and Lena Park, and all of it. She said it the way she said things she had thought about, carefully, steadily, without performance. Not for you. For me. Because carrying it was the last thing I was still carrying for someone else, and I'm done doing that. He sat with that. He had not expected to hear it today. He had not come hoping to hear it. He had come to say something true, and she had received it and said something truer, and he sat in the chair in her office in the West Loop and felt the specific weight of 12 years acknowledged and released without ceremony. Thank you, he said. She nodded once. He stood up. She stood up. At the door of her office, he stopped and looked at the photograph above her desk. One more time, the beach in Portugal, the laugh, the woman who had not yet started keeping records. She was happy that day, he said. She was, Isisa said. And she's all right now. He walked out through the lobby and past the receptionist and into the elevator and down to the street and into his car. He sat for a moment. Then he drove. Back into the city, back into the afternoon, back into the ongoing work of becoming the man that the woman he had failed had, despite everything, believed he was capable of being not for her, not anymore, but for whatever the next 30 years asked of him. He drove until the building was behind him, and the city opened up, and Chicago did what it always did, spread itself enormous and indifferent and full of ordinary lives in every direction. And Damian Kade drove through the middle of it alone, which was exactly right, and continued. On the desk in Serena Whitmore's office on the 7th floor of a building in the West Loop, besides the window with the good light, the black leather case sat on a shelf with 3 other case files, clearly labeled, neatly organized. The Atlas Ledger was no longer the only record in the room. It was one of many. Each one had her name on it. Each one belonged completely to her. Outside the window, the city moved. Serena sat at her desk and opened the next file and began to read.